All right, we've got the lights, we've got the camera. Action. Okay, so let's let the fun begin. It's great to be in front of so many people, many more people than we expected. That's a good thing. Many more people who are dedicated to helping autistic individuals lead fulfilling and productive lives. And there's many ways that we can go about doing that. Today we'll explore different approaches, different ways of working with individuals on the autism spectrum. And the idea here is not to try to prove that one method is better than the other, that ABA is better than TEACH or floor time or Miller method or whatever we might be looking at. The idea is to take a look at some of the different approaches, some of the more commonly used approaches, well thought out approaches, with the idea of matching practice to individual needs. So I was just talking with a fellow, he's right in front of me, he's involved in equine therapy. Equine therapy is great stuff. Is it for every autistic child? Maybe not, but there's certainly plenty that it is good for. And part of what's done with equine therapy is there'll be an assessment to see if it will help the child. And if it does, then you go and you use it. And that's how we're going to take a look at the approaches. So to open, let us start with the game of figuring out what the difference is between the two pictures. What's on the top and what difference between the picture on the top and on the bottom. Who's got a difference? Way in the back. You got one? Or are you just kind of stretching? All right, so at the bottom of the pole, this thing, that's missing. All right, you got 12 more to go. Yeah. On the zebra's leg? Oh yeah, there's a stripe missing over here. All right, yeah, we're getting some of them. Any from up front or over here? Yes. All right, so you look at this stripe here, the bridle thing, it's red here, and it's blue over here. So anyways, here's the rest of them. So that was good. We got 3 of them right away, right off the bat. So in considering what we were looking at, now it's time to take a little quiz. What was it a picture of anyways? It's a carousel, we got that. What animal is in the foreground? Zebra. What color is the animal behind the first one? We're not exactly sure. How many animals in the row closest to us? So the questions are getting harder. And the reason why I did this is that I forced you to perceive these pictures the way autistic people perceive the environment. We focus on detail, and sometimes at the expense of the whole. So if we think about detail-oriented thinking, where is it advantageous to be detail-oriented? What are some situations, or perhaps jobs, or situations where you really want a detail-oriented person? Bookkeeping. Police officer, what else?
Reading x-rays.
Reading x-rays.
Inventory control.
Inventory control. So we just got 4 really good examples. Often we look at computers, such as computer programming and so on. So might it be possible to say that if we put a typical person in such a situation, that they have a deficit in detail-oriented thinking? Yeah, we might be able to say that. And the reason why I bring this up is that we can take the characteristics of autism. So often we look at them as deficits. So often we hear in the definition of autism, deficits in communication, social interaction, restricted interest, repetitive motions, sensory issues. But perhaps we should look at these as characteristics. They're not good, they're not bad, they just exist. And are there ways to use these characteristics in a way that's beneficial to the autistic individual? And in situations such as IT, we see small software companies actively seeking autistic individuals to work for them because they know that some of us, not all of us, it's a relatively small number of us, who can do things in IT that nobody else can. So what I'm looking at is the idea of turning away from what I call a deficit model of autism to an abilities-based model of autism. We need to be asking, what can the individual on the spectrum do? And by the way, I saw some of you sneaking some pictures here. Don't sneak it, be open and notorious about it, and take all the pictures you want, because this stuff is meant to be shared. So that's perfectly fine. Take all the pictures you want, and however it helps you, just go for it. So that's, anyway, so the idea is, let's ask what the person can do. And as we look through the different approaches, we'll take a look at how we can make that happen. So what brings me here to talk to you about different approaches? Well, let's take it from the beginning. Things were pretty typical at first. At 24 hours of age, my wife says I looked like an egg. And then at 18 months, like what happens to about 30% of us on the spectrum, the regressive autism bomb exploded, where I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, and withdrew from the environment. And this is something we don't know what causes it. There's many questions. What's the cause? What do we do about it? And we're still asking these questions today. We don't have a firm grasp on the cause or causes of autism, but we do have a really good idea as to what to do with autism. And I can find you too. Yeah. And the key word is with, because so often we think about doing things to autistic people to eliminate various behaviors and whatnot, make autistic people more like everybody else. But we've been trying that for a long time and it hasn't worked. But what we can do is we can work with the characteristics. So it's moving from what I call awareness of autism. So we've been pretty good at developing awareness of autism. So good that we know autism, pretty good at knowing when autism is in our midst. And we're up to a prevalence rate of about, depending upon who you ask, 1 in 68 or 1 in 40. And I think what that suggests is if the prevalence rate keeps going the way it has been, within the next generation, there'll be more of us than not. So we are taking over. And I see you agree with me.
I think it's more like
1 in 20?
1 in 30. What was it? Jersey, college, Rutgers said it's like 1 in 35 in Jersey.
Oh yeah, it depends on where you are. If you go to North Korea, it's 1 in 30. No, South Korea. In North Korea, we don't know what it is, but in South Korea, it's 1 in 38. So there's a lot of autism. And there's all kinds of theories as to why why this is the case. And long and short is we don't know. It starts with genetics, and then it's something else in the environment. And there's a lot to be said for genetics. I remember meeting the dad of the first child I worked with. And I said, hey, Dad, you know, I think you're autistic. Dad didn't like it. Well, then I found out that Dad didn't eat solid foods until he was 9.5. He also had what I call a negative autism diagnosis. And what I mean by that is that after months of seeing doctors, the result was a letter. Dear Mom and Dad, your child cannot be autistic because he's talking. Well, now we know what that's called. So then Dad realized he's either on the spectrum or he's close to it, and helped him understand his son, who was much more significantly affected. So that speaks to the genetics. You have an autistic person, you'll probably see characteristics in their family members. So anyways, back to my situation. It took my parents a year to find a place for diagnosis. And when they did, the doctors said they'd never seen such a sick child, and they recommended institutionalization. But fortunately, my parents, like so many parents today, how many parents of children with autism do we have? All right, a good number. Good, that's where it all starts. So you advocate for your kids, and that's what my parents did, except it was a little bit more unusual in those days. Because the prognosis of an autism diagnosis then was an institution. And if things went really well, then maybe the person would get out of an institution like Willowbrook and do a little something outside. But now we know a lot more. And my parents convinced the school to take me in about a year. And it was during that year that my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program that emphasized music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. Except in those days, that terminology didn't exist, and the concept of early intervention even didn't exist. So it was just parents trying to figure out how to best reach their child. So what did they do? Well, first they tried to get me to imitate them. How many of you have used imitation as a teaching strategy? Parents, teachers, everybody, yeah, we've all used it. It's a time-honored approach. But sometimes it doesn't work with autistic people. Maybe it's a lack of mirror neurons, or whatever it is. Sometimes we just have a hard time imitating, at least, especially when young. So then my parents flipped it around and they imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment. Then they were able to move me along. And I think the key implication is that whatever approach you use, you have to develop a trusting relationship first. Then you can move on. So with the work that my parents did, speech began to return, and I entered the school that initially rejected me. I got reevaluated. Instead of being considered as psychotic and ready for an institution, I got upgraded to neurotic. So things are looking better in the world. I also discovered the wonderful world of watch motors. So I was found in our kitchen taking apart a watch with a sharp knife. Pop open the back, take out the motor, take that apart, play with the gears, and put it all back together again, and the watch still worked, and there weren't any pieces left over. So incredible fine motor control to take apart a watch. But, do we have any occupational therapists here? One lone OT, two lone OTs. Well, that's a problem because that's way too few. So you can ask your friendly OTs over here, how could it be that I could have such fine motor control to take apart a watch, not even using the right tools? But when it came to penmanship, it was just a total disaster. And that's fine motor control as well. And I see you over here using a bit of sign language. So what does that mean?
You had like eye tracking probably issues. My son has that. He's doing it now.
Oh, eye tracking.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Pretty high. Like comorbidity.
Yeah, it's pretty common. Comorbid is the term. It's a terrible sounding word, but all it means is you got two things going on at the same time. Nothing more, nothing less. You can use concomitant if you don't like the word comorbid or co-occurring, but that's what it is. Anyways, it's an interesting question to ask. So my parents, instead of looking at the closed door of disability, disorder, and deficit, they looked at the open door of ability and soon provided all kinds of other devices to take apart and put back together again. So they were working with me. They accepted the characteristics. So it's moving from awareness, okay, we know that autism is here, we know the characteristics, moving towards, well, let's work with those characteristics. If you got someone who's really good at taking apart watches, for example, what about fostering that interest and seeing if we can shape it in such a way that it might involve maybe fixing watches or something else later on, depending upon where the person is developmentally. So that's my example of working with. And I see people over here kind of waving, or maybe they're flapping.
Somebody's phone is on and like.
Oh, it's just going at it. Yeah, I bet it is, yeah.
One of the people who work here.
Oh. Maybe we should give it to security or something. So that also brings to mind different approaches. If we think about what my parents did, there was no ABA, no floor time, no, like at the Rebecca School kind of down the street that way. There weren't any of these approaches. There was some sort of primordial version of behavior modification. My parents didn't use that, If you look at what they did, it was probably one of the more developmental approaches we have today. Maybe like Miller method or floor time or RDI. And it's not to say that the behavioral approaches are trash and we should trash them, but all it means is that my parents figured out what I needed, and even without the terminology, they provided for those needs to support what I needed. So speech is beginning to come back, and now let's take a look. It's a great time to transition into these different approaches. One way to look at it is that methods or approaches fall into three major areas. You've got the educational, behavioral, developmental approaches. That's on the top. And that's when we're talking about ABA, floor time, daily life therapy, and all of that alphabet soup that you're so familiar with. Another area is sensory. And I've got another workshop where we talk about sensory issues. So come to that one if you want to find out more. And one way to summarize it is that occupational therapy and this fellow over here with equine therapy also work to treat imbalances of the outer and inner senses. So some of the senses are up too high and too much comes in, some are down too low and not enough comes in, and what comes in tends to be distorted, including that ocular problem you were talking about over there. And then you got the biomedical piece. And that's where you hear talk about issues related to digestion, such as gluten and casein-free diets, potential role of vaccines, other techniques, medical techniques, to help people on the autism spectrum. And again, depending on the person, you might have an individual who needs a lot of sensory before you can get to the other stuff, or you might have someone who needs a lot of behavioral education and less on the other stuff. So it depends on the individual. For me, I probably had a profile that looked like this, except the sensory was much bigger and the biomedical was smaller. Or you might have someone who has a whole pile of biomedical needs, and you've got to address those before you can continue. So that's the context. We're going to take a look at the educational approaches, the behavioral, developmental approaches. And what we're looking at here is a summary of my almost 500-page doctoral dissertation. Because what I saw was that we had a number of approaches, and they did good things, but nobody had bothered to compare these approaches. I mean, sometimes you'd find a study that would say something like applied behavioral analysis that's contrasted with eclectic approaches, and then you kind of know who would win with that article, so you didn't need to read it. And I think that's the wrong way to study it. What we need to look at is getting familiar with these different approaches and then use bits and pieces or all the approach as needed for the needs of that individual. So what I did is I talked to some key developers and thinkers in these approaches. So with ABA, I rang up Ivar Lovas and started talking to him. Eventually he referred me to one of his students, Tristan Smith. I talked to Gary Mezeboff, who co-founded Teach. Dr. Kyo Kitihara from Daily Life Therapy, who developed that in Japan. She was no longer with us, but I did talk to someone who had a lot of experience working with her. Arnold Miller of the Miller Method was alive, so I could talk to him. And Serena Weeder of Floor Time, who I think has moved to the New York area, by the way. I could talk to her too and find out about these approaches. I asked these people how they essentially thought about, how they defined autism, how they explained certain behaviors, and then what are some recommendations for interventions if you want to address these behaviors. So a lot of interesting stuff. One is that they all agreed that the definition of autism that we find in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it was severely lacking in fully explaining autism. And that made sense because the DSM, it's not meant to be a diagnostic tool at all. It's really the Bible for insurance reimbursement. Now, at the very best, you might be able to use it as a sort of screening tool, but that's about as far as it goes. So all of the hundreds of mental disorders, and I'm not sure if we can call autism a mental disorder, but it's in there anyways. But each one of these has a number. And autism has 299, for example. And different ones have different numbers. So sometimes we can refer to, if you're autistic, you're in club 299. So none of them could agree on, I should say all of them agreed that this definition doesn't fully explain it, but at the same time none of them could agree on what autism is. One of them didn't believe in sensory issues. One of them had other ideas, and so on. So if we don't have common agreement as to what autism is, well, that's something that needs to be resolved too. There's certainly other approaches out there, other worthy approaches, but I had to finish the dissertation sometime in the lifetime of my committee, so I just left it at almost 500 pages. Key is almost 500 because if it went over 5, it would have had to have a second volume, and I thought one volume was enough. So there's plenty of other approaches out there. There are techniques as well, such as sensory integration, such as equine therapy, such as picture exchange communication systems. And what we're looking at are comprehensive treatment models, CPMs, what they're referred to. And one way to think about a CPM is something that a person would be engaged in for a long period of time, intensively. So think of it as something that you could spend all day at a school. So I've seen ABA classrooms, I've seen ABA schools, and that's something that drives the method all day for the kid. And so that's a comprehensive treatment model. I've seen the same for TEACH, daily life therapy. There's a school up in Boston where there's 160 kids on the spectrum, and that's what they do all day. And likewise for Miller method and floor time. And that differentiates from a technique which you might be found used within the approaches. You wouldn't find someone doing sensory integration therapy all day. You wouldn't find someone, as much as it would fun to be, you wouldn't find someone riding a horse all day, and so on. So that's how we differentiate the two. And if you want to find out more about these approaches, I also put it in this book. I guess the best thing to say is that I'm the dummy who wrote this book. So now let's take a look at some of these approaches. Let's take a look at ABA. That's been around the longest and has the most publicity. And as we look at this video of ABA, I want you to think about what seems to be important in this ABA classroom. What seems to be the focus of the person who's being interviewed? What supports do you see for autistic children? Schedules, visual supports, prompting, whatever else there might be. So let's take a look. Now that everybody's gone deaf,
ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis. The goal of ABA is to teach children the skills that they need to learn from their environment. Basically, it's identifying specific behaviors and modifying them and keeping data.
let's fix that.
So that you can tell what is changing.
Well, let's count. 1, 2, 3. Who's in school today? Who's in school today?
When you begin an ABA program, you assess the child and you identify different skills that you want to work on. A very important part of an ABA program is figuring out what's reinforcing to the child So you would use a reinforcement assessment to determine what's going to motivate the child to learn. The more powerful the reinforcement, the more rapid learning will occur. I try and stay away from food reinforcement. I use computer. Most of my children love computer and they'll work for computer. They'll do anything for computer. I have one student who works for the piano. I have one student who works for puzzles. Well, he works for puzzle pieces. So as we're working, every couple of answers that he gets right, I give him a puzzle piece, and then when the puzzle is filled up, he can go and play with it. It really depends on the child. I have one kid that loves high fives. So, yeah, something as simple as that you could, it's more natural. I keep data during one-to-one work and during their workstations. With 6 students, it's really difficult for just me and one paraprofessional to keep data on everything. I try and target specific skills that the students need during group activities and work on that individually. Let's see, today is number 19. Up, find number 19. Find number 19.
Monday.
Find number 19. There's number 19. I'm concerned about what's going on at home. How can we teach your child things that are, that's going to make his or her life easier at home. Every week we take a trip to the supermarket. It's a very important trip because a lot of the parents in my class say that they can't go to the supermarket. They can't take their child to the supermarket because they pull everything off the shelves. They are running up and down the aisles. They don't know how to behave. This is a really significant thing to a parent. They need to be able to take their children out in the community and feel comfortable. So we take a trip to the supermarket every week and we learn how to behave and we learn how to use money, we learn how to choose things. Here! Say, I want to give them out. Here you go, Ted. When a child is diagnosed with autism, the ideal situation would be for them to start ABA therapy as soon as possible. So whatever age that diagnosis comes, parents should start looking for therapy.
So, what did you see in the ABA classroom? What seemed to be the focus? Heard something over here?
Reinforcement.
All right, so reinforcement, reinforcing behaviors. What else? Repetition. Yeah, a lot of data, rewards or reinforcements. Did you see any supports? Pictures? Okay, hand over hand. Yeah, pointing at numbers. Heard something else over here, maybe? All right, so these are some of the things that we're focused on in the ABA classroom. And speaking of reinforcements and punishments, sometimes they get a little bit confusing, especially when it comes to positive and negative reinforcers and punishments. So anything that increases the probability that a behavior is going to occur, that's a reinforcer. Anything that decreases the probability of a behavior, that's a punishment. And then inside these reinforcers and punishments, you can go positive or you can go negative. So positive reinforcer, that's probably the one we're most familiar with. You do something, then you get something else. You pay attention or do whatever the task is, then you get to play with the ball. So then you get to go on the computer. So that's probably the most familiar. And then there's negative reinforcement. And that is when something that you don't want disappears. So you take out the trash, the bad smell is gone. How many of you have used negative reinforcement? All your hands should be up. Think about when you were a kid and you'd nag and complain and whine to your parents that you wanted whatever it was. Might have been an ice cream, might have been to go somewhere. And then your parents say the magic words. All right, just this one time. Then suddenly you stop complaining. And you are now an expert, you didn't realize this, you're an expert in the application of negative reinforcement to your parents. And those of you with kids, maybe they do that to you too. And there's a hand up in the back.
Taking a break is
Taking a break, it's negative reinforcement. Oh, break from doing work. And it all depends on how you use it too. So it could be taking a break, but sometimes it could be you do your work, and then you get a 2-minute break to do something else. So it depends on how it's done. And then there's the punishments. Decreasing the probability of behavior. You drive at normal speeds. Now later today it's going to rain. Maybe it'll get cold enough. There'll be a little bit of snow. If you don't slow down, then you might get something you don't want. So maybe you won't do that again. Or on the computer, how many of you have deleted a message when you really didn't want to delete that message? So that's a negative reinforcer. So the engine that drives applied behavior analysis is the idea of the functional behavior assessment. And this is a real gift that the behaviorists have given to us. The idea that we should examine behavior and we need to find the root cause of the behavior. However, it's important to make sure that you look at all aspects of the behavior. Because sometimes what I find is that people may give short thrift to doing a full functional behavior assessment. And what I mean by that is we need to be asking the question why. So let's take an example. I've got a nice student over here, and your name is? Catherine? We got Catherine over here. And this is my math class. And in my math class, I pass out a worksheet. There's, say, 10 questions or 12 questions per page. It's a multiplication worksheet, and everybody's at the learning multiplication, so it's a reasonable thing to be giving everybody. But what does Catherine do? She rips it up. Well, that's not something that I want. Why is she ripping it up? Well, now it's time to take my data. One thing I'll look at is the frequency. How often is it happening? And what I find is that it happens about 50% of the time. 50% of the time. It doesn't really matter what day it is, but it's just about 50% of the time she's going to rip it up. Now, why is she ripping it up? That's what we need to get into. And might it be that she's a math genius and she has all the questions down in 10 seconds and now she's bored? Or is it the other way around? She hasn't learned addition yet, so why are we making her do math? So that's a curriculum mismatch. That could be one. Or is it something related to the environment? Because what happens is with Catherine, she's hypersensitive to light. And that light over there to her is like looking into a spotlight. And it just sets her off. It's just not working. So there's no way that we can fix this unless we deal with the environment. It may have something else to do with the environment that it doesn't occur to us to perceive, or we may not even perceive, but the person may be perceiving. So for example, I know of autistic people who can hear electricity in wires running around in the room. And most people don't hear that, but if you do hear the buzzing and it bothers you, well then that's going to cause a problem. There might be a visual perceptual problem, maybe like what you were talking about earlier. Maybe she can't see the problems clearly. Maybe they all kind of run into each other. Maybe we need to, maybe she gets distracted. Maybe we need to reprint the test with one question per page. Or teach Catherine to take a couple pieces of scrap paper and cover up the problems that she's not working on. So many things that we can look at that could be causing the issue. Maybe it's a plain old medical issue. Maybe she doesn't feel well. Maybe she has some sort of food intolerance and she's gotten into various foods. So these are all things that we look at. But something that's really curious is that it's happening about 50% of the time. But I can't predict what day it's going to be on. And we have math every day. So all the usual suspects, such as having trouble transitioning out of the weekend, trouble transitioning into the weekend. We can't blame those. So what are some things that we might consider? Who's got an idea? You almost have one.
Well, the person that they're dealing with, what they're bringing, what they're communicating.
So we definitely want to pay attention to what Catherine's communicating. And you had your hand up too.
Is a transition issue like with other classes, like a specials or something, so therefore it only happens part of the time instead of every day of the week? Or is she affected by weather? Some people don't do well when it's really rainy outside or snowy.
All right, so something related to the weather. Is it something that happened in the class before hers? Way in the back.
Could it be, she held it together the day before instead of the next day is hard?
So she held it together. It was all she could do to hold it together yesterday, and today she's all spent. That could be, and a variation on that is kids who hold it together in school, but come home and have a big old meltdown. So that's a variation on that possibility, because they are holding it all together, and what that means is we need to give that person, that student, a transition period at home, instead of immediately asking them to engage in some sort of therapy. And when you think about it, when you come home from work, do you transition, or do you immediately get into whatever you need to do? And some people really need that transition. So what we do with Catherine is we talk to her parents. We talk to other people. And that's part of doing a functional behavior assessment. We talk to other people in Catherine's life. And guess what I found out? I found out that Catherine really has this thing for Fruit Loops. And in the morning, she's got to have her Fruit Loops. But sometimes there is no Fruit Loops in the morning. There's Cheerios, but Cheerios, even though they're round, they're definitely not Fruit Loops. So she doesn't get her Fruit Loops, and the rest of the day is, that's just it. So that is the slow trigger. When we look at behavior, we consider the antecedent, what happened before the behavior. I gave her the worksheet. What is the behavior? The action under consideration, ripping it up. I need to be very specific about the behavior. What's the consequence? And one way to think about consequence is, what is the maintaining consequence? Put the word maintaining in front of it. Because consequence sounds a little bit like, well, if you rip up that paper, you're going to have to stay in for recess for the rest of your life. You're going to pay the consequences. But really what the consequence is what happens after the behavior that increases the probability it's going to happen again. That's the consequence. And when we look at the antecedents, there's two types. There's the fast triggers on the bottom, and those we see, we can identify those. Rips up the paper. The slow trigger, this is something you can't see, but it's something that kind of sets the student off. It chips away at the person's ability to tolerate stress. How many of you have slow triggers? Everybody's hand should be up. So on days when you didn't sleep well the night before, for example, then maybe you're a little bit edgy during the day. That's a slow trigger, and nobody knows that except you, or unless you tell someone. So here's some slow triggers, here's some fast triggers. And when we think about behavior, it's important to explain it in measurable terms. So what's the problem with all these behaviors? There's a problem with these behaviors. Or do they look like they describe behaviors pretty well and we're pretty set with it? So if you saw these, did you say something? Well, maybe I'm hearing things. You're about to say something.
They all have something underlying. That's not the actual behavior. It's the composition of something else.
That's the composition of something else, something underlying. You had something in the back? They're too broad, right. So if you're going to describe a behavior, it's got to be described in such a way that somebody else can come and observe and see the same behavior and count the same number of times it occurred. So what exactly is impulsive? Oh, it seems like that Catherine jumps out of her seat unexpectedly. Okay, that's something I can measure. I can see it, and I can count that. And likewise with any of these, they're too general. So in describing behavior, you need to be very, very specific. So with the behavioral approach, it's important to be aware that you want to make sure that you or practitioners are not over-focusing on modifying the behavior before you find out why the behavior is occurring. Because if you don't know why it's occurring, then you'll be unsuccessful in modifying it. And also sometimes punishments end up being reinforcers. So you got to watch out for that too. So for example, here I am at a school. I'm their music teacher. It's a school for autistic children. And I saw one of these behavioral consultants dragging a child across the floor on her coat, probably to a timeout room. And the first thing I thought was, yeah, that looks kind of fun. What do I need to do to get that? So I don't know how reinforcing that consequence was for her, probably pretty reinforcing. It also might be that being told you got to stay in for recess and you got to stay in the library for recess, how's that going to play out for the child who gets bullied during recess and really would rather be reading books anyways? So I don't know if that's a punishment. So things like that, you got to watch out for. All right, we're moving on to teach. Treatment and education of autistic and related communication handicapped children. So all of you can memorize that. Just call it teach.
Someone has a question over here.
Oh, there's a question. I didn't see you. There you go.
I'm listening to, I'm going back to their behavior, and I'm trying to see where this fit in terms of my grandson who is not verbal. So, last he comes from school, he left very happy, excited. When he got back home, he had a period where he kind of shut down for a while. And I'm trying, and his mom really trying to figure out what happened during the day that he looked at because he's 8 years old and he's not verbal. So what would you recommend that we, or what, no, if there's anyone else here that
All right, that's a good question.
verbal, how can you find out?
Well, let's talk about that. How do you find out why a person's doing what they're doing if they don't speak? So what that suggests, even before we get to what we might do, is the importance of teaching the child a reliable means of communication. And what I mean by that is if the person isn't speaking, can we teach them sign language? Can we teach them to point at pictures? Can we teach them to type on a computer? And I know a number of non-speaking, and I actually prefer to use the word non-speaking rather than non-verbal, because there's a lot more in verbal communication than just using words. Non-speaking. I know many non-speaking autistic people who, once they get on an assistive communication device, we find out they're just as smart as the rest of us, maybe even smarter. They just don't speak. The neurology is just not there. So anyways, we've got someone who doesn't speak, who may have some significant challenges. They go to school, they're really happy. They come home from school, they're not so happy, and they shut down. So basically something is stressing them out. And what that thing is, well, it means going in and talking to the teachers. It means observing, having somebody observe what's happening there. What is causing that person to have what might be, you could think of it as an internal meltdown. There's external and internal meltdowns. External meltdowns, well, you know one when you see one. You get all kinds of outrageous behaviors. Internal meltdowns, that's another word for shutdown. Something overloaded the person. And now you've got to use the concept of a functional behavior assessment as to why that's happening. You've identified the behavior very well, He shuts down, he's quiet, he doesn't interact. That anybody can measure, anybody can see. And now you've got to figure out why. So you go back in and you're seeing what that is. It may be something that's fairly obvious, maybe somebody's bullying the child, could be another classmate, it could even be a teacher. It might be some other aspect of the school day that's just getting to him, just like things can get to us too.
Could be the bus, child bus.
It could be, yeah,
Loud bus can do it.
sure. All right, well, let's get back to this stuff, but that was a good interlude. Teach. So teach, what we find is a combination of the behavioral sciences, the social sciences, and the cognitive sciences. And teach is an approach that focuses on working with autism. So the idea of teach practitioners is let's understand the autistic culture and find ways to work with the abilities of that child. So an example of a common characteristic of autism is that we tend to be visually based. Not all of us, but it is a tendency. So if that's the case, what kind of visual supports can we provide in order to help that child be successful? We also know that autistic people need structure in order to be successful. So there's a lot of focus on building structure into the day. So that's another example of working with the characteristics of autism. So let's take a look at teach, and the same questions apply. Well, I see a hand over there, we'll get to you in a moment. The same questions apply. What seems to be the focus? What supports are there? And what's similar and what's different from the behavioral video that we saw on ABA? Oh yeah, the one question, yeah. I can't quite hear you. The sound isn't quite coming here to me. Are you saying you're not able to see this?
Yes.
Oh, then stand over here next to this fellow.
Somewhere on the website so that you go.
Oh, yeah, it will eventually find its way onto the website.
You cannot do it as of now in order to follow what you're saying.
Oh, no, it's not on the website now. But if you send me an email, I'll send you a copy of the presentation of the PowerPoint. Yeah, I can do that. All right, let's check out the teach video. Let's take a look, and then we'll talk a little bit about it.
The treatment and education of autistic and related communication handicapped children. The primary goal of TEACH is to help the child with autism reach his maximum ability by the time he's adult age to be as independent as possible, and for him to be a successful, happy member of the community. TEACH is a complete program of services for people with autism, which makes use of several techniques, not just one. But the physical arrangement of the room, the individual workstations, the individual schedules, the visual cues, that's all part of TEACH. And also understanding the world of autism. You have to know the whole culture of autism. Children with autism are different than regular children. They process things differently. Like the children with autism, they learn better visually than verbally. Like if you give them a verbal direction, they may not understand. But if you show them visually the direction, give them a visual cue, it makes it much more clearer to them. Some parents get their children to early intervention, which starts at 2.5, 3 years old. But if not, then they'll go into at age 5, when they go into regular school, they would start the TEACH program. Our school, they would keep them to 21. We keep children with autism to 21. You could use TEACH combined with ABA, combined with the Miller method, combined in inclusion setting. You could like different aspects of the program you can use in every methodology. Some students you can see like within a week's time, you see the change in the student. Others may take a little longer, maybe a month. Sometimes it takes the whole year. And even if it's a small little progression, you know, that you see, it might be minute, but you do see improvement. Feelings, speech when we go out. This is a shuttle. It's going to be Jason Target and McDonald's. It's like if you're doing an art. It's like recreational things. So this is a book that would go home with the kids. I would definitely recommend Teach for all children on the spectrum. There's many aspects of Teach that can be used that can benefit all children, such as the physical arrangement of the room, the individual schedules, the workstations, the visual cues. All students could benefit from that. I think you told us everything you wanted. You want White Castle, you want Baskin Robbins, and you want...
All right, so Teach. What seems to be the focus on Teach? Visual, the physical environment. There's a lot of focus paid to the environment, making things predictable. So often we hear about the need for autistic people to have a predictable environment. So is Teach better than ABA? Well, it might be for some people, and it might not be for others. So when we look at Teach, as I mentioned, these are the three areas that Teach draws its theory from: the social, cognitive, and behavioral sciences. And there's a focus on the importance of observable behaviors and pleasurable consequences for desired behaviors. So there's a lot of influence from applied behavior analysis. There's also a focus on family collaboration, working with the family. And often you'll see communication notebooks or worksheets like this going back and forth between the parents and the school. And the idea is that this is a great way in which to determine what possible slow triggers there might be for the individual. Now let's take a look at another approach. Now this one's rather unusual. It comes from Japan. Daily life therapy. Now if we were to transport to Tokyo and go slightly east, we'd find a school with about 2,500 students. And it's known as an elite private regular education school. It's expensive and there's a long waiting list to get in. Now if you observe the school, you'll find that about a third of those students are autistic. And they're included with everybody else. So one interesting aspect of this approach is that the same approach is used for regular education as well as autistic education. And they found a way to include these students in a way that they're just doing what everybody else is doing. So they start out with a period of initial stage guidance, which gets the student used to the routines of the school. And then there's three major pillars of this approach where they focus on physical activity, emotional regulation, and intellectual stimulation. So the physical activity piece, the day starts with a 2-mile jog around the school. So how many of you would do better if you jogged 2 miles around the school? Yeah, probably everybody. You have to work up to it. But that helps regulate the body. It certainly helps with sleep. We know that autistic people have difficulty with sleep, often. So that's a good way to help regulate sleep. And then there's emotional regulation. And that's done through an extensive arts program. So they have a music program, which culminates in a jazz band, which would hold its own with any other jazz band that we'd find in a public school. Again, the physical education piece, they spend a lot of time in the gym doing things that we don't expect autistic people to be able to do, such as riding unicycles, doing gymnastics, and things like that. There's an emphasis on vocational education. Children with autism grow up to be adults with autism. And we all go to work for a living, and that includes autistic people. So there's a big emphasis on getting people, those students, out into the community, working in various jobs. And one thing they found is that after graduation, the infamous service cliff occurs, where there's relatively so few resources and supports, everything would just fall apart. And the reason why is that the world is not the Boston Higashi School. It doesn't have that structure, doesn't have that understanding, doesn't have those routines. And there are some people who are able to just go out into the world and transition into it, and they do fine, perhaps with some supports. And then there are other people who just aren't able to do that. So the Higashi School teamed up with parents, and they've developed what they call Higashi houses. So these are group homes of students who used to be in the Higashi School, and the program carries on there. I mean, not everybody needs this, but enough of their students do. And so that's helpful with transition to adulthood. Now the school there's a Higashi school in Boston as well. It's like a smaller satellite. There's about 160 students there. And all of those students are on the autism spectrum. And they use the same approach. So these are some of the characteristics that we see: the importance of structure, life experience, bonding with others, group dynamics. They do a lot of things in groups, whether it's jogging around the school, whether it's engaging in sports activities, and so on. And the power of the group, well, it's pretty strong. So for example, if I asked, let's see, who should I ask? I'm going to ask you. Would you stand up and act like a monkey? You wouldn't be too thrilled about it. No. But you might do it, but you wouldn't be happy about it. But suppose I were to say, okay, everybody up and let's all act like monkeys, and I model it. Would it be a little easier? So that's an example of the group, the power of the group, and they use that. And what this does is help the person become part of a caring community, feeling of leading fulfilling and productive lives. They also teach what to do when you have nothing to do. So what do you do when you have nothing to do? You've got it all figured out. But sometimes autistic people need some direct instruction in this area. So now let's take a look at a video from Daily Life Therapy. And in this video, again, let's take a look at what are the similarities, what are the differences, and what seems to be the focus of this school. So let's take it from, I think we can take it from here.
Receiving cafeteria cleanup is that first step of learning to do that. And some of the kids pick up on it very rapidly. Some kids progress to the point where they can direct others. And all of them get to the point where they get skills that will help them in the future when they're working in the community.
It's always so nice to see the kids that are graduating. They're ready to go, and they know that they're ready for the next step in their life, for the next step in their journey. And we're just happy that we got them to where they needed to be to lead. Take care of yourself. You did such a good job there, right?
Every student here is loved. There's no favorites or least favorites. Everyone here is special in their own way. Everyone. Thank you, Albert. This is why I like the school. Because when I was in New York, I was treated horribly and by bullies. Here, it's like literally I'm family here. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. This is why I love the school. I will always be grateful for the school. When I'm dying on my deathbed at deathbed at age 90 or 100, I'll be thinking of this school, most likely. Unless I have dementia. The school has really motivated my self-esteem to a new height I've never seen in my life.
So what seems to be the focus of this school? Sports? Emotions?
Hugging.
Hugging? One more time? Social interaction. Now I saw your hand up, but I didn't hear you. Universal design? Music, yeah, there's a lot of music in this school.
Everybody works.
Say again? Life skills, yeah. Life skills.
Everybody works.
Everybody works, and everybody works together. One more.
Seems like they're constantly keeping them
Active,
active.
yeah, boy, they keep them active all right. Yeah, so everybody's in good physical condition, and that includes the teachers and the staff. Because they all go, they all do their jogging. So an interesting approach, interesting way of going about things. All right, we now transition to developmental approaches. So we've been looking at the behavioral approaches with applied behavior analysis, with TEACH, with daily life therapy, which comes from that Higashi school. It probably should be called the daily balanced living. I think something happened in the translation between Japanese and English, because there is that focus on leading a balanced lifestyle. And now we transition to the cognitive, the developmental approaches with the Miller method. And what's the difference between a behavioral approach and a developmental approach? Because all of these approaches are focusing on changing behavior in one way or another, so isn't that behavioral? And it has to do with the theory. So with the behavioral approaches, it's about the science of behavior. With developmental approaches, it's about where is that person developmentally? How does that person perceive the environment? How do they think? And that's that cognitive piece. How do they think? And let's take a look at the Miller method with its idea of systems. That's what drives the Miller method. So whereas the functional behavior assessment drives the behavioral approaches, the system drives the Miller method. And what is a system? It's defined as an organized unit of behavior around an object, event, person, or an idea. And the idea and the concept is that a system will be disrupted in order to increase learning. So what is meant by that? Disrupting a system to increase learning, to increase communication. Check out that stop sign. What's wrong with that stop sign? It's upside down. What else? Skewed. And it's off center. So this is something you would notice. When you're driving, you see stop signs all the time. You stop, hopefully, but you don't really consciously think about them and notice them. You just see them and you do what they're supposed to do, and that's a system. Now you get something that disrupts the system to a slight extent, suddenly you're noticing it and suddenly you're talking about it. Another example of a system that everybody has relates to pictures. Suppose we got a nice picture on the wall and it's hanging a little bit crooked. How many of you would notice if a picture is crooked? How many of you would it bother you if it was crooked? How many of you would have to come to the front of the room and fix it so that you can pay attention? That's a system as well. And by applying a disruption to that system, that causes you to focus and it causes you to want to complete it. And that's how the Miller method works. Let's take a look at an example of the Miller method. And again, the same stuff as before. What's the focus? What's the similarities? What are the differences?
We treat the whole child. We don't treat anything in isolation. What I mean by that is every lesson, we start up on the elevated platform on the square. We'll do a fine motor activity such as drawing, writing. Sometimes it's just rolling and squeezing Play-Doh. We'll do a cognitive activity, as you saw earlier. We'll be doing numbers with Tristan in a fun way by playing more with cars, which is bigger because he's up to that. So we'll incorporate the whole child. We'll do big body stuff. We call it small body and big body. It's fun, fine motor and gross motor.
And push.
His big body work today was pushing the balloons with his feet and his hands through the holes on the Swiss cheese board. And what we do is, whatever they learn up there, under optimum circumstances, we then try to generalize it at the tables. We have specialized tables and stools where the children will replicate whatever activities they do up on the board in terms of coloring, counting, numbers, communication. We'll do it at the table as well. We have the children approach the world in a way of order and disorder, because our world is made up of order and disorder. There are certain things that are regimented in our lives. You go to work, you eat breakfast, whatever it might be. Then there's disorder in our lives. You hit a traffic jam. It's pouring rain, you can't find a parking spot. These kids, for the most part, have to be taught coping skills. So rather than teaching them coping skills, we try to head that off at the pass by just creating disorder in their lives. We have two diagnostic tools. One is the Miller Diagnostic Survey, and that's on the website, millermethod.org, and that parents can either, it's like 106 questions, can either submit and transmit online, or they can give it to me and I can submit it. And we have a program that actually generates where the child falls in every single area of their functioning, cognitive, sensory. It lets us know exactly what the child's strengths are, what the child's deficits are, and whether or not they can most benefit by this program. I would absolutely recommend Miller Method to parents of all children on the spectrum. Every child can benefit by it. As I said before, a child that is very, very ritualistic will show progress within 3 sessions. A child that is not involved in objects at all, and is not involved with people. It'll take over a few months perhaps, but every child will make progress.
What's the primary goal?
To make the children come alive, to make them come alive, to want to be a part of our world, to be able to function and communicate with us, and let them come into the room, to give them that foundation.
So what seems to be the focus of the Miller method? Play. All right, what else? Individualized instruction. What else? All right, so the children are inspired to make order out of disorder. Right, the order is satisfying. That's the idea of the system, yes.
I actually have a question. The questionnaire she mentioned that has tons of questions that
Yes.
engage where the child
Right.
was exactly. Is that available somewhere? I mean, that sounds such a powerful tool.
It's a very powerful tool, and it is available on their website. And you can fill it out for free. However, if you want them to analyze it, yeah, there's a fee. So they get you for, I don't remember what it is, maybe it's $100. And then if you find the information useful, then that $100 gets applied to a more extensive assessment.
Where is that school?
That school is in kind of all over the place. This school's in Queens, but they're not doing these 3 approaches anymore. The Miller method is now located up in Boston. It's always been there, actually. And they do most of their work now through video conferencing oversight. So they've got a program out in Russia, for example, at Our Sunny World. So I've been over there a number of times to teach Miller method and other such things over there. I know that it was, but I'm not exactly sure if it still is, because I know things shift around some. But it's used in a number of places. I know it's being used in California at a school out there. That I do know. So with Miller method, another important aspect, and there was a person over here who was getting right to it, and that is, so often we think about the autistic person needing order. Needing order. Everything needs to be ordered and predictable. However, the world is not ordered and predictable. And there's a focus in the Miller method to teach the child how to cope with varying amounts of disorder. Varying amounts of disorder. So that's an interesting twist in looking at things. So let's close out by looking at a case study. We've got Greg the ball thrower. So here's Greg. He's an elementary school non-speaking child. He's got autism, and if he finds a ball anywhere in the room, he'll just grab it and throw it. That's what he does. He'll throw it against the wall. He won't necessarily throw it at a therapist, but he'll just throw it. That's what he likes to do. And if you try to take the ball away from him, you get a catastrophic meltdown that lasts at least a half an hour. It only happens with these objects. He's just fascinated with balls. Who knows why, but there's a lot of children on the spectrum who get fascinated with particular things. They get stuck on them. And if this object is anywhere in the room, it's just all over. He'll find it. So he's the type of kid who will find a ball if it's in a drawer, if it's on top of a shelf. And once he gets it, he won't be able to do anything else. He often squeezes the ball hard. So our friendly occupational therapists will find this interesting. He presses it against his cheek. He's what I call a Jay Leno kid. So you all know who Jay Leno is? And he's got this huge chin. So this is the type of kid who comes up to you and pushes his chin into your face, into your shoulder, into your head, whatever it is. And that's the kid who's seeking deep pressure. That's the type of kid he is. Now you try to engage him by rolling the ball to him. He's unable to kick it. He's not quite sure where his body is. He gets upset when you try to play with him. He gets mad and he hits the therapist. So it's written in his educational plan that all balls be kept out of sight. But his teachers aren't always successful in doing so. So as a result of Greg's behavior, he's considered one of the most difficult students in the school. So we call him the consultant. And the consultant identifies these balls as a powerful reinforcer. So what are we going to do? How are we going to work with this child? They've tried setting up a behavior plan where if he does this, then he gets that. So it's the standard, do this, get that. But he can't do the this when he knows that that is there. It's just not happening. So that type of strategy doesn't work. Is there something else you could do?
It sounds as if they don't have enough data.
They need more data, you think?
Yeah, and not just around ball throwing, but other things also. And very specific.
Anytime. if there's a ball in the room, if he were in this room, and if there was a ball in here, if one of you has a ball in your bag or something, he's going to find it. And if you try to take it away from him, it's all over. If you have a ball, well, you better have 2 balls because he's going to get one of them. And then he's going to want yours too.
If they're working towards the idea, if he works for something to get it, the ball should not be in the room where he's going to get it. It should be in another location. So he would go to that location. Maybe to pull out to OT or take it into speech or something like that instead.
All right, so we pull it out of the room. Somebody brings it into the room, but you can't get it back from him again because it's just like a 1-minute break.
I would create a sensory diet or sensory breaks throughout the day and make that a routine so that he will learn to say goodbye to the ball.
He definitely needs a sensory diet. So here's another way to look at it. And this is what a Miller practitioner would probably do. He'd do something, or she would probably do something like this. They'd come into the room with a sack of balls. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds of them. And go up to the kid and you say, here. He takes it and throws it. Here's another one. Here. Throws it. Here. Throws it. Here. Throws it. Here. Changing the position of the ball a little bit. Here. And the person looks at me and takes it. So I've changed the dynamic. Instead of being the taker or weigher of balls or the hoarder of balls, now I've become the provider of balls. And now I'm going to use these objects in which to teach whatever needs to be taught. Maybe counting. We can categorize by color, by size, by type of balls. We can have the student bring the ball to her parent. Because now we're not in the business of keeping them away, but we're in the business of working with them. And that's the difference between doing things to an autistic child and working with the characteristics. So using that object of interest. And that's another characteristic of the developmental approaches, is a little bit like with the behavioral approaches. Let's find out what makes the child tick. What is the reinforcer? And then, instead of holding it out, let's bring it in and use that reinforcer to work with the kid, to teach communication, or whatever needs to be taught. And our equine therapy guy over here is kind of nodding up and down because that's what they do with equine therapy as well. All right, so I've shown you 4 approaches. There's many others. And the idea is, how can we match approaches to individual needs? So as you think about these approaches, which one do you like the best? So to you, how many of you does ABA speak to? It just kind of makes sense, fits with your philosophy. How many of you are ABA-ish type people? All right, so we got a few here. Maybe we have more and you're not telling me. How many of you like Teach? And if you had your druthers, you'd learn more about Teach and maybe use that. We got one. What about daily life therapy? Now, that seemed to grab a lot of people. And yeah, you can raise your hand twice, that's fine. And what about Miller method? And we got some others for Miller method. So the point is, it's not which approach is the best, but it's the approach which best fits. And that also includes practitioners. So all of you who like ABA, it works for you, you know how to make it work, it makes you feel good when you use it, and you see gains with kids that you work with, well then that's what you should keep on doing. For those of you who raised your hand with daily life therapy from Japan, well, that may be a way to go, because that works for you. And likewise with Miller method, I saw a lot of hands go up with Miller method. If that's what makes sense with your philosophy, with your personality, with your makeup, then you become a Miller method practitioner. And just like different approaches speak to you, some more louder than others, likewise with children, some approaches will work better than others. So I think now is a great time to get into questions just like you have over here. I don't know if you can hear me because these guys are pretty loud.
My question is, how well known are these different approaches to the therapists and teachers? I'm a parent.
Right.
I hear a lot from the therapists about ABA and teach occasionally. The other two I haven't heard about. So I don't know whether the therapists know about this. And then we can have a conversation about what works for me, and maybe they could do similar things to support my child.
Right, and that's an important question. How do we talk to therapists about that? How do we find therapists that focus on these different approaches? Some of them are more well known than others, especially the behavioral approaches. They've been around the longest. They've had the most amount of publicity. ABA and Miller Method started at about the same time. One of them wrote an initial article in Psychology Today, and one of them didn't. And you can probably guess which one did. So that's part of the issue. Secondly, you can look for therapists. So if you're interested in the Miller Method, you go to the Miller Method website and you ask, where can I find a therapist in New York? There are some here. How can I find out more about it? And likewise with any of the other approaches, if you like daily life therapy, if you think that might work, then you find the Boston Higashi website and you ask the same question. Or maybe you contact all of these therapists and you figure out which one seems to be the best fit. So that's how that works. Yes?
So in December, I just found out that all three of my boys, I have three boys, 8, 7, and 2, they all within the same month got diagnosed with autism.
That's like a jackpot.
Right, so but we were dealing with sensory issues before. They have also like a extra genetic material in one chromosome, so we always dealt it with that, but
Right.
they never actually got a diagnosis. So this became like a game changer for me. And I've been looking at the therapy that you just mentioned, but when I've been going to a lot of reaching out to other parents or reaching out to other places of community, they said I can't even tackle the therapies until I deal with it biomedically and by like changing their diets and so I actually want to know like how important is it to actually implement or tackle something biomedically before even putting in therapies or other types of things. They tell me that it's not going to have any success.
All right, so the question is, do I need to address things biomedically before I get to the behavioral approaches? And the question is, it depends on the child. So you may have a kid, you have 3 kids, or maybe 1 or 2 of them, they have these huge biomedical needs, they have difficulties with eating food, they seem to have some immune system issues, then you gotta go fix it. If they seem to be eating relatively normally, then maybe what you found is some kind of biomedical zealot type person who's only focused on biomedical. And that's what happens with these approaches, is that many therapists or practitioners, they get so focused on their particular approach that they ignore the others. And so it depends on the person. Remember those circles that I had where you might have some kid that has huge biomedical needs and they're making a wreck out of their life, they're not digesting their food properly, they have problems, various medical problems. Well then, yeah, you got to check that out. And you might have others that physically they seem relatively healthy, so then it doesn't have to be biomedical first. It depends. Go ahead. They absolutely can be complementary. And what we need more is practitioners to have greater awareness of the different approaches. And nobody can become a master of all the approaches. But you'd want the biomedical person to be able to say, you know, the kid seems relatively healthy, maybe we need a couple things here and there, and go find yourself an educational, behavioral, developmental person, because that's what you really need.
The NYU Child Study Center approval of this approach, or using more than one approach?
The NYU child, I don't know enough about it to say. I'd have to ask them. There was a question like down here somewhere.
Integrative medicine center.
Okay. Yes.
What do you do when you're dealing with, say, like the DOE program, for example, and you have a child that's gifted to gifted, high IQ, and they're in the classroom and their neurotypical peers are behind them. And let's just say they're in a program this year that they weren't in last year, and it's behind the program they were in last year. What do you do, because behavior is not necessarily, like when you think it might be just straight up boredom, the child's announced they're bored all the time. How do you get the school to comply with giving them more appropriate work?
Yeah, sometimes, it starts out with you, the parent, talking to them, and if they don't listen, then you gotta take it up a notch, and you find an educational advocate.
Right, well, we have that. I'm just saying, when you're in a specific program, one you might be familiar with, I saw you speak there last year.
Okay.
There's a very set way that program works.
Right.
So you can't really go in and retool their system.
Mm-hmm.
I was just curious, like, how you can kind of gently work with people to kind of realize that sometimes it's not always sensory, it's not always behavior, it might be downright boredom.
Yeah, well, without knowing the specifics, it's hard to say beyond talking to them and basically saying what you said. And if they don't understand that, then you've got to take it up a level, because it sounds pretty clear.
So you mentioned it's a personal question, if that's okay. When your parents, they were very involved in you, and at that time these different methods weren't there. My question is, what did, I have a child, 3 years, and I'm just trying to figure out what the parents best I can do, apart from all the therapists and all that. What did your parents do that was very helpful for you? What aspect of whichever of the different 4 or 5 methods, as you know, for your more emotional and happiness aspect?
All right, that's a good question. It's a good question to wrap up on. And if you have more questions that we didn't get to, I'm sure there are, there's my website. And you can always email me, find out more about my books. I've got them translated into various languages, and ask questions in more detail or questions that we didn't get to. But as for my parents, I think the biggest thing that, the greatest help that they were was they accepted me for who I was, but also realized that there was a lot of work that needed to be done in order to lead a fulfilling and productive life. So it's kind of like that working with philosophy. And then secondly, the idea of if I wasn't going to connect with them, because they tried to get me to imitate them, then they would try to connect with me. And I think that was probably the first major breakthrough. And one place that you can see real efforts where therapists connect with kids is in music therapy. Oh, we got a music therapist? Huh? Got any more? All right, well, a lone music therapist, that's a whole nother presentation, music for autistic children. So on that note, it's been great talking with all of you, and I'll see you at the next workshop.
Therapy up front here.
Yeah.